So really simply, it's define your carbon footprint, calculate it, reduce it, and then neutralize it. But of course, there's a lot of complexity in each of those steps.
Hello, welcome to Sustainability Voices, the podcast dedicated to exploring the impactful stories behind the voices driving sustainable change. I'm Patrick Obeid, founder of a climate tech startup and your host for this series. In today's episode, we will explore the importance of carbon neutrality with Sonali Samani from IWG. Stay tuned as we uncover various facets of sustainability, voice by voice. Today, we're joined by Sonali Samani, head of ESG at IWG, which has made a groundbreaking stride by becoming the largest provider of carbon neutral office space in 2023. Sonali, we're thrilled to discuss this remarkable journey with you.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here and to share more about the journey we're on at IWG and to be collaborating with you.
Super excited to have you. Thanks again for making the time for this. Sonali, for our listeners, could you break down what carbon neutrality really means?
Yes, absolutely. So really, carbon neutrality is ensuring that the impact your operations are having on the planet are neutralized through positive actions. For most ethical organizations, I would say that means starting with reducing your carbon footprint and then investing in positive carbon removal solutions to balance the remaining footprint. To be a bit technical, the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero is that carbon neutrality focuses only on direct emissions, so scope 1 and 2, whereas for net zero, you would take accountability for all of your indirect emissions, or what we typically call scope 3, so things like your logistics, your supply chain, your waste management. So carbon neutrality for us is a milestone on the journey towards net zero.
That is super interesting. Thanks, Sonali. Taking a step back, why is achieving carbon neutrality a crucial goal for companies today?
For me, I think the main thing is a lot of us have net zero targets. So IWG's net zero target is 2040. And carbon neutrality is a part of that journey. It's a milestone in your journey to really clarifying your scope 1 and 2, and then moving on to scope 3. And I think it's really critical because for a company choosing us as a customer, they can feel reassured that we've taken a genuine step to balance our impact on the planet. And for our customers, it's really important because it helps them to better calculate their scope 3 to understand that actually the office space that they are choosing to contract with hasn't got a carbon footprint that they're passing on to the customer.
Absolutely. You bring up a really good point here, Sonali. I agree. I think everyone keeps talking about different regulations and the regulatory pressure and the investor pressure, but I'm a true believer that it's going to be the customers driving the journey of different companies, because at the end of the day, you know, customer retention and customer expansion are core pillars for success of any business. I'm really curious to dig into the path to carbon neutrality. Could you kindly outline the essential steps for us of what a carbon neutrality path look like?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's actually quite simple for carbon neutrality. We always start with defining our carbon footprint and then calculating it. I see those as two separate steps because you've got to get clear on what your operational boundaries are. You need to understand exactly what you're including in scope 1 and 2, and then calculating it. Then you can reduce. A lot of companies do that through things like transitioning to green electricity, and then finally offset or invest in carbon removal products to reach carbon neutrality. So really simply, it's define your carbon footprint, calculate it, reduce it, and then neutralize it. But of course, there's a lot of complexity in each of those steps.
Absolutely. I love that framework, and I'm excited to dig in shortly. I'm curious, how do you envision carbon neutrality fitting into your broader business goals? I know everyone talks about carbon neutrality, and in most cases, businesses think that carbon neutrality comes at the expense of business success. However, at IWG, it seems that carbon neutrality is deeply integrated into your broader business goals. I'm curious to understand, how do you see it fit into the bigger business picture?
Absolutely. I think the first thing to say is that hybrid working actually helps people to reduce their carbon footprint. We have 8 million users globally, tens of thousands of organizations come to us. And one of the key reasons is that we make hybrid working or flexible working more possible. We have offices in rural and urban places, meaning that people can reduce their commute times, but still be working in a safe space outside of the home where they're sharing resources, or can flexibly work between a headquarters in the city centre and also at home. We recently did some research with Arup, which actually identified that working hybrid can reduce your carbon emissions by up to 70%. And for us, that's the critical piece. It's actually our business model needs to enable carbon footprint reduction and other sustainability goals. So overall, we're talking about what is the impact IWG and working at an IWG has on an organization's sustainability and how can we support that? And for us, that's really about net zero, it's biodiversity, it's water, and also social support, things like well-being support. And critically, neutrality fits into that, particularly on the carbon net zero target, but actually on the piece around engaging our customers in the importance of all of us taking responsibility for our actions. And our customers are finding that a really helpful signaling point, even asking for us to share our carbon footprint with them and share information about how we achieved carbon neutrality, because it helps them to share with their employees the impact they're having.
Absolutely. I was just taking a step back and reflecting on this over the weekend, and I'm a deep believer that the future of living and future of working is, what I call like a 15-minute city. And even like, I come from a very small country in the Middle East called Lebanon, and I went back to visit family in January, and it was just looking for a place to work for a week, and the only place that I found was a Regis office, which I know fits under the IWG portfolio. So I know this is the beginning of a very long-term revolution, and we're excited to be part of that journey with you, Sonali. So thanks for sharing that intel.
We completely believe in the 15-minute city. There should be a space to work in every 15-minute city because it is a critical part of the ways of working and having a future of work where it's not this blurry line between home and work, but it's a comfortable work-life balance for all. If we had more office spaces that met the requirements of people and the way they work today, it would be a better working world.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I was reflecting on is like, I know food app deliveries are all like unprofitable, and I've been thinking about why are they unprofitable? And the main reason is, an average trip is like 30 minutes to get from restaurant to home. And if we were to recreate that world where you limit the options to a restaurant within a 10-minute or 15-minute bike ride, can't imagine the carbon impact that would bring, but also more importantly that it would increase the EBITDA and the profit margins of your business. So obviously this is not an easy journey, and every journey comes with its challenges. I would love to hear from you about some of the biggest challenges and how the IWG team overcame them.
Sure. I think in terms of carbon neutrality, the first or largest step for me is actually getting to a verifiable carbon footprint, which is of course where ESG Flow comes in. I think to me, the easy part for me is understanding your business and agreeing a fair and sensible methodology. That's simple. If you understand your business, you know where your impact is. But then being able to calculate it is a whole different ballgame. And especially in our case, getting enough consumption data, accurately reading those invoices, it's time consuming, it's costly. And until you find the right partners to work with, it can feel like an insurmountable problem. And I think for me, the learning was that all organizations need to think about the right way to harness technology to improve their carbon footprint and making it as accurate as possible, whilst accepting that we're not going to get it right first time. Nobody has perfect data. This isn't, finance or accounting. We have to accept that we're on a journey. And that's a really important mindset shift. If almost look at technology and get it as good as you can, but accept that it's not going to be perfect, and helping your stakeholders to understand that as well is crucial.
Absolutely. I think you touched upon two really good points. Like one, it being a journey, and the second is communication. Yeah, I think in the finance world, a dollar is a dollar, and ensuring totality is a lot easier because you can just balance your sheets and making sure that a dollar in is a dollar out. I think in the ESG world, there's 1,000 metrics. It's a very nascent industry, and then there's a lot of unstructured raw data. So being able to bring structured and validation to that is gonna take time. But the good news is we live in a world, as you said, where AI can be integrated into that strategy from the ground up, and hopefully can create a more efficient, more transparent, more traceable system down the road for all companies. And second is communication. I think I am yet to meet an investor that needs to know the details of scope 3, for example, but they need to be able to understand the impact of that specific metrics on the business. And I think this is where leaders in your shoes have a very challenging road ahead, because you still have to do the work, but at the same time be able to take a step back and paint the right story. But just looking back at 2023, it seems like you've you've done great so far. And I know IWG reached its carbon neutrality in 2023, which is a very impressive achievement. It's a massive milestone for our listeners. I'm curious to hear, and I'm sure our listeners are also curious to hear, what are some of the key factors that led to this success?
Sure. I think actually the main success factor was having absolute commitment from the top. We had actually agreed a carbon neutral target for 2025, but I strongly felt that bringing it forward was the right thing to do for the business and particularly for our customers. But we were in a really privileged position because our CEO and our board were absolutely agreed that this is a key commitment, and them having a belief in carbon neutrality as the right thing to do made a huge difference, especially because they understand it as important for our customers, our employees, our shareholders. And that coalition really helps make the right decisions. So where you're trying to then prioritize between net zero goals and other targets such as diversity and carbon neutrality, it actually made things easier because there was an acceptance that we needed to do all of those things and we needed to make steps across the board in our sustainability journey. And therefore, sort of signing off what is an investment in renewable electricity, in carbon offsets, is a big conversation, but it made it easier because there was absolute alignment that we needed to make this step. And I think that's a really helpful element, and almost getting that coalition agreed before doing the work helps smooth progress in a significant way.
And I love hearing that. And I agree with you. I think it's all about getting the right stakeholders on board and getting their buy-in as early as possible. And I see a lot of organizations trying to do this step really fast because they want to get to work. But the problem is if you don't have the buy-in from the executives on the top, things will be super slow down the road. Sonali, thanks for sharing that. Can you share some insights into the strategies or innovations that made this possible for IWG?
Absolutely. I think actually, in terms of strategy, we followed a fairly simple approach. We calculated our carbon footprint, we verified it, and then we reduced in sort of fairly obvious ways around improving our energy efficiency, moving to green electricity. But I think the bit that was a little bit more innovative is identifying the right carbon offset. For me, and I think actually for the organisation, we didn't like the idea of a third-party voluntary platform. I completely understand that for some companies that's the simplest option, but it didn't feel in keeping with IWG's ethos. It meant we were quite far removed from the investments we were making. And so we really researched and looked at some options, and fundamentally were able to find that if you use a third-party voluntary platform, you don't have the same depth of due diligence, you don't have the same closeness of relationship. But a game changer for us was actually meeting a forester from the Amazon directly. And it meant that we were able to build a much stronger relationship and worked with him in part because he doesn't just have, an organization of our size, of course, has to get a Verra or UN or gold standard. We have to get a right quality of carbon credit. But actually, he has a social carbon credit, which I think just suddenly changed the conversation for us because it felt like something that was in keeping with our ethos. He invests in the community. He was even able to actually set up specific projects helping women to create jobs through planting of native species. And I think that really changed the story for us because it felt like an investment in the right things and not just a carbon credit, which I think can have a less positive feel for the organization. And I think that made a real difference in feeling close to the investments in nature that we were making.
That is such a beautiful story, Sonali. Thanks for sharing that. Sonali, for companies that are inspired by IWG's accomplishment and are looking to embark on a similar journey, what recommendations would you give?
I think I would start with, as we kind of already referenced, leadership alignment first, being really clear on what are we aiming for, particularly from a customer, an employee, and shareholders or other stakeholders perspective, and getting absolute alignment with at the highest levels of leadership. So for me, that would be the board, but also the layers within that. So senior leadership and middle management need to be aligned on the journey, the goal, and actually to be keeping them abreast with decisions on a regular basis. So one of the things I've done is set up a quarterly stakeholder update, and it just keeps people informed and means that you have much more support in that decision making. I think it also helps to have a good amount of customer feedback on topics about what you're doing. It really helped us to engage a broad set of stakeholders when we talked about the feedback we'd received from customers about our carbon neutral journey. it really meant that we were able to corral the organization behind this as a target and meant that we were actually able to get there earlier than planned. I think beyond that, in terms of what you're looking to do, each journey is different, of course, but starting with the data and then working in every small step that you can take, it all makes a difference and adds up in the end, in my opinion. So it's not the easiest of journeys, but I think each organization, if you've got the right leadership support, can make it work in the end.
Absolutely. So, Ali, curious to hear if there's one thing you wish you had done or had not done, or had done or had not done earlier, what would it be?
One thing to do earlier, I think, and I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you, is to have invested in the data. Our first couple of years of carbon footprint reporting were really challenging because we were trying to do it much more manually. The over-reliance on Excel felt palpable versus moving to a system. I think it changes the conversation when you can have more confidence in your data and being able to report more in a more timely manner. So quarterly reporting, not annual, for me, I think is one of the biggest opportunities if a company can afford to do so.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I agree. I think we live in a world where you're going to be expected to report to more stakeholders at a higher frequency with higher validity of the data. So the earlier you can invest in that data infrastructure, the better set up for success if the business can afford to take the time and money to do that early on. I would love to just take a step back and look at the industry more broadly. I know you're completely disrupting, you're creating this industry. I think if we're going to look back and listen to this episode in 10 years, everything we're talking about is going to be super obvious. But I really, I'm super grateful for this conversation because I know IWG is at the leading edge of, disrupting how we're going to work and how we're going to live in the coming decade. Looking beyond IWG, how can carbon neutrality initiatives impact the wider industry and the global sustainability movement?
Thanks. I think carbon neutrality is such an interesting topic because large corporates have actually just begun to get really behind it, and they are very focused on reducing scope 1 and 2. And then meanwhile, the sort of avant-garde, very advanced ESG organizations are denouncing carbon neutrality. And we don't need to get into the whole political situation, but what I think is so critical to remember is that, particularly for large organizations, every step is important. And for me, I think carbon neutrality is a really critical milestone. It means you've reached something and it makes that 2040 net zero or 2030 net zero target feel more immediate. And having that interim target is so important. And I think for us, achieving carbon neutrality felt like a really key milestone, a step in the journey that meant we were moving in the right direction. And I think for other organizations, that's what I would hold on to, is it's about making the milestones and each step is important. And I think it also means by having one of these sort of more clear targets rather than we'll reduce by 20%, is there's a clear line in the sand. There is an official definition and it's a clear thing that you have reached. And I think that feels really important, especially for engaging employees, I would say. It feels like an achievement and a step that is important. And I guess broadening that out to broader industries, and in particular the real estate industry, being able to show that we're taking responsibility for our actions is so crucial. If every organization became carbon neutral, that would be, an unprecedented reduction in total emissions. It would be a huge investment in removal solutions. So whilst I think it's a small step, if everyone did it, it would be game changing.
That is very inspiring, and I could not agree with you more. Even, us at ESG Flo, we're a very small startup, fewer than 30 employees, and this is super important to us. And, we are tenants of IWG, and we will need that data as well because we will need to be carbon neutral very soon. So it's really nice to see you at the leading edge of that. I'm curious to hear from you about the role that you envision IWG is in leading and encouraging broader change towards carbon neutrality in the business world.
We are the largest organisation in the hybrid working space, and by offering carbon neutral workspace, it creates a standard that we hope other organisations will need to follow. Sadly, very few offices have carbon neutrality to date because it is a challenge, and therefore I think our announcement and even sharing how we've reached there helps other organisations to get there. I think similarly, we hope to advertise a sort of broader story around our investment in green buildings, renewable electricity, our targets towards net zero, because I think it will encourage the industry to get there. equally, I think there is something in saying, wherever you are on that sustainability journey, particularly for smaller organizations or organizations in more developing countries, we're quite a strong believer in the just transition and making sure that transition is equitable. And I think actually it's about saying, let's just make sure everyone is making steps in the right direction. So if that's a community fundraiser or just having a carte blanche technology that's not being used must be turned off, I think I'm open-minded to how we lead that change, as long as each organization is thinking about how they impact their carbon footprint, whether it's commuting less or becoming carbon neutral. It's just making the right steps so that we're all moving in the right direction, really.
Absolutely. And I think there's a direct correlation between carbon consumption and or carbon emission and energy consumption at the end of the day. So carbon reduction means cost reduction for most businesses in a way. And I think it's just about, telling that story in the right way, or finding the right angle or finding the right edge for businesses early on to be able for them to get started on this journey. This was a very energizing conversation, Sonali. Thank you. As we conclude our inspiring conversation, I would love to hear from you. What's the final takeaway you'd like to share about the importance and impact of carbon neutrality?
Thanks, Patrick. I think for me, the final takeaway is that for every sustainability professional, it's looking at what impact your business model has. So if that's hybrid working, being able to reduce carbon emissions, and then saying, how do we amplify that? So for us, that was carbon neutrality, meaning that people can commute less and be in a low carbon building. That's brilliant. But whatever the right steps are, reaching your net zero target, for me, I think just having clear interim goals to get to net zero is the critical thing to do. For us, that was carbon neutrality. It might be for different organizations, but knowing that you're making clear steps is, I think, the key.
And this is extremely exciting, Sonali. I can't wait to learn more about all the amazing things that you and IWG will achieve in the coming years. Sonali, it's been a privilege to hear about IWG's journey to carbon neutrality. Your insights are invaluable for any business looking to reduce their carbon footprint. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope today's episodes motivate you to explore carbon neutrality within your own spheres. Join us next time on Sustainability Voices for more enriching stories of sustainable progress. Sonali, thanks again. This has been a pleasure. I learned so much from this conversation, and I hope and I'm sure many of our audience and listeners were inspired from today's conversation. Thank you. This is the Sustainability Voices podcast. You can find all episodes of the show at esgflo.com, Spotify, YouTube, Google, and Apple Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd like for you to subscribe to stay connected. I look forward to welcoming you on the next episode of Sustainability Voices. My name is Patrick Obeid. You can find me on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for listening.